It began with a benevolent promise: free health care for the poorest citizens in the South. It ended 4 decades later, as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in the history of medicine. By the time the truth finally leaked to the press in 1972, the human cost was catastrophic. 128 men had died directly from syphilis or its complications. 40 wives had been infected by their husbands. And 19 children were born with the disease seared into their blood from birth. But these were not casualties of a foreign war. They were victims of their own government. For 40 years, the United States Public Health Service didn't just watch these men die, they actively blocked them from living. They withheld the cure to protect the data. They traded human lives for autopsy reports. This wasn't just negligence. It was a slow-motion massacre, conducted by men in white coats. This is the file on the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and the dark truth hidden beneath. To understand the crime, we must first feel the desperation. The year is 1932, Macon County, Alabama. This is the heart of the Black Belt, named for its dark, rich soil, but defined by its crushing poverty. The Great Depression has decimated the cotton market. The African-American sharecroppers here are living in conditions that the rest of the modern world has forgotten. Most live in shacks with dirt floors, no electricity, and no plumbing. Many have never seen a doctor in their entire lives. They are isolated, illiterate, and incredibly vulnerable. Into this vacuum steps the United States Public Health Service. They didn't see human suffering. They saw a nature's laboratory. Preliminary studies showed that 35% of the local population was infected with syphilis. To the researchers in Washington, this wasn't a health crisis to be solved. It was a goldmine of data, waiting to be extracted. But they had a problem. How do you get hundreds of men to participate in a study that offers them nothing but observation? You lie. The doctors created a masterclass in manipulation. They arrived in shiny government vehicles, bearing the seal of authority. They hired a local nurse to gain trust. And they used language the locals understood. They didn't say syphilis. They said bad blood. This was a catch-all phrase for everything from anemia to fatigue. They launched a propaganda campaign, posting flyers in churches and schools. The most infamous was the pink slip, a letter sent to the men that read, "Last chance for special free treatment." It was a cruel mirage. The treatment was nothing more than pink aspirin and iron tonics, placebos that did absolutely nothing for the disease. But the doctors offered incentives that these starving men couldn't refuse. Hot meals on examination days, free transportation, and most grimly, burial insurance. For a man who couldn't afford a coffin to rest his bones in, the promise of a dignified funeral was a powerful lure. They signed their names or made their marks with an X, believing they were being saved. In reality, they were signing a contract to be watched until they died. To understand the longevity of the nightmare, you have to understand the routine. For the men of Macon County, the arrival of the government doctors became a seasonal ritual, as predictable as the harvest. They called it Government Day. It wasn't just medical, it was social. The doctors didn't come alone. They came with the one person who made this entire machine run, Nurse Eunice Rivers. She was African American, a local, trusted by the community. She was the bridge. And she was the trap. She drove the government station wagon, she delivered the babies, and she sat by the bedsides. The men trusted her implicitly. They didn't know that her primary job was to track them like tagged wildlife, ensuring that not a single subject drifted away from the study's grasp. Under her gentle guidance, the men were shepherded into the most brutal procedure of the study: the spinal tap. The doctors needed to know if the syphilis had migrated to the brain, but you can't ask a man to volunteer for a needle in the spine. So, they lied. They told the men they had a bad back and needed a special free shot to strengthen them. This was the golden needle. The pain was blinding. It felt like a lightning bolt shooting down the legs. Men would collapse, vomiting from the agony, unable to walk for days. And yet, Nurse Rivers was there, holding their hands, telling them it was good medicine. They thanked her. They thanked the doctors for the torture. But the true turning point, the moment strictly defined as a crime against humanity, arrived in the mid-1940s. The world had changed. Penicillin was discovered. It wasn't just a treatment, it was a total cure. By 1943, the Henderson Act was passed, mandating the testing and treatment of venereal disease across the nation. Mobile treatment centers were eradicating syphilis in weeks. The epidemic was ending. The researchers in Tuskegee looked at this miracle cure and panicked. Not because they feared the disease, but because they feared losing their specimens. If the men were cured, the data stopped. The decision was made in cold blood. The Tuskegee group must remain untreated. The lengths they went to enforce this blockade were military in precision. They didn't just hide the cure. They actively hunted down men who tried to find it. When World War II drafted the young men of Macon County, 256 of the subjects tested positive at induction centers. The Army ordered them treated. The Public Health Service intervened immediately. They sent urgent telegrams to the draft boards with a simple, chilling instruction: exclude from treatment list. Men who were ready to die for their country were denied the right to live for themselves. One specific case haunts the files. A man we'll call Subject 402. He was young, intelligent, and suspicious. He heard about a rapid treatment center in Birmingham giving out the new shots. He packed his bag. Nurse Rivers found out. She tracked him down at the bus station, not with force, but with kindness. She convinced him that the city doctors didn't understand his special condition, like the government doctors did. She brought him back. Subject 402 never got on that bus. He died 15 years later, insane and blind. As the 1950s and 60s rolled on, the bad blood took its final toll. This is the tertiary stage. The bacteria, Treponema pallidum, begins to consume the host from the inside out. It creates gummas, soft tumor-like balls of inflammation that eat through skin and bone. Men's noses collapsed into their faces. Their aorta walls thinned until they ballooned and burst, drowning them in their own blood. The neurosyphilis set in. Fathers who were once gentle turned violent. Husbands forgot their wives' names. They walked into the woods and screamed at demons that weren't there. And through all this suffering, the doctors watched. They wrote notes. Subject shows signs of insanity. Gait is unsteady. Lesions present. They never offered a pill. They offered a funeral. The study offered a $50 burial stipend. But there was a catch. The family only got the money if they agreed to a full autopsy. In the poverty of Macon County, $50 was a fortune. It was the difference between a pine box and a pauper's grave. So, grieving widows, desperate for dignity, signed the papers. they allowed the doctors to cut open the husbands they had just killed, handing over the final piece of data. The government had been waiting 40 years to collect. How does a conspiracy like this survive for 40 years in a democratic nation? You might think it was a rogue operation, hidden in a secret underground bunker, known only to a few mad scientists. It wasn't. The Tuskegee study was an open secret. The researchers did not hide their work. They bragged about it. Between 1932 and 1972, they published 15 major reports in prominent medical journals. Thousands of doctors read them. The medical establishment knew. The CDC knew. And yet, for 4 decades, nobody stopped it. This exposes a terrifying dissonance in American history. Consider the year 1947. On the global stage, the United States led the prosecution of Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for their horrific experiments during the Holocaust. We helped establish the Nuremberg Code, the global gold standard for ethical research, which states clearly, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. At that exact same moment, U.S. government doctors were violating every single letter of that code in Alabama. They were doing to their own citizens what they were hanging Nazis for doing to prisoners. How did they justify this hypocrisy? They viewed it through the lens of scientific racism. This was the pseudo-scientific belief, prevalent in the medical elite, that African Americans were physiologically and psychologically different from whites, a subspecies that had smaller brains and didn't feel pain or disease the same way. This wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. Even when the study was finally reviewed by a CDC committee in 1969, 3 years before it ended, the doctors voted to continue. Their reasoning was chillingly bureaucratic. The data wasn't complete yet. They hadn't harvested enough autopsies. This connects to a much larger, darker pattern of institutional betrayal. Tuskegee isn't an anomaly. It sits on the same shelf as the radiation experiments on citizens during the Cold War, or the forced sterilizations in Puerto Rico. It reveals a medical system that viewed vulnerable populations not as patients to be cured, but as raw material to be consumed. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as it was designed for those in power. The nightmare ended not because of a sudden moral awakening within the government, but because of a leak. In 1972, a whistleblower named Peter Buxton, who had been fighting the system from the inside for years, finally exposed the study to the press. The story hit the front page of the New York Times. The public outrage was immediate and explosive. The study was terminated, but for the men of Macon County, justice was too little, too late. A class action lawsuit followed, resulting in a $10 million settlement, a pitiful fraction of what their lives and suffering were actually worth. It wasn't until May of 1997 that President Bill Clinton finally stood before the handful of survivors still breathing and offered a formal apology on behalf of the nation. He looked them in the eye and said, "What was done cannot be undone." And he was right. The damage was permanent. The true legacy of Tuskegee isn't just written in the history books. It is etched into the blood memory of a community. It planted a deep, rational seed of distrust in the medical system that persists to this day. When we ask why marginalized communities hesitate to trust public health initiatives or vaccines, the answer lies in the red dirt of Macon County. The most terrifying part of this story isn't the syphilis itself. It's the silence. The silence of the hundreds of doctors, nurses, and researchers who watched it happen for 40 years and did nothing. We dig up these files to ensure that silence never wins again. If you believe the truth matters, no matter how dark, subscribe to the forgotten files. Until next time, question everything.